This is one of my favorite topics I've explored before. Stories about new houses where unsuspecting folks discover something, or sometimes someone, that doesn't belong. First story. This happened a few years back, but even now, it still leaves me with an uneasy feeling whenever it crosses my mind. Honestly, the only reason I feel okay sharing it now is that enough time has passed, and I don't think there's any risk in putting it out there anymore. At the time, my wife and I had just moved out to the suburbs after living in the city. We'd recently had our third child, and between all the baby gear, toys, and the sheer chaos of 3 kids, our apartment felt like it was shrinking around us. So, we started house hunting and eventually found a nice little place in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The kind of area where folks told us you could leave your doors unlocked and not think twice about it. The house wasn't huge, but compared to our cramped apartment, it felt like a palace. One thing that immediately caught my wife's attention was the backyard. It had this gorgeous, slightly overgrown garden with a handful of old statues scattered around. They were weathered and had this eerie, almost medieval vibe, like something straight out of Game of Thrones. I know it sounds odd, but my wife and I both thought they gave the yard some personality. I didn't have much of an opinion on it, so I left the statues where they were. Less work for me, and I wasn't about to complain about that. A few days after moving in, I was standing by the window, taking in the view of the garden, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, a stone angel, I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were turned toward us, so this one looked out of place. I could have sworn they were all facing the same way before, but I wasn't entirely sure. I chalked it up to me misremembering and didn't give it much thought. But the next morning, I glanced out the window again, and that's when I saw it. A second statue had turned, also facing away from the house. This time, I was sure something wasn't right. I asked my wife if she'd noticed anything unusual, but she just shrugged it off like it was nothing. I started to wonder if my son, Jimmy, was behind it. He was a mischievous little guy back then, always pulling pranks. But when I asked him, he just gave me this confused look, like I was crazy. Honestly, I doubted he could have done it anyway. Those statues weren't exactly light. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. I didn't want to blow it out of proportion, so I tried to ignore it. I had bigger things on my plate anyway, like money troubles and the constant fear of losing my job. A few days passed without any more weirdness, and I started to relax. Then, one evening, I looked out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. All the statues were lined up in a row, right at the edge of the house, just standing there. It was like a scene from a horror movie. I know it sounds absurd, but I swear, I could feel their stone eyes staring right at me. My chest tightened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't decide if it was more terrifying or just plain bizarre. I knew I had to check it out, so I cautiously stepped outside. Before opening the back door, I scanned the yard, half expecting to see someone lurking in the bushes. It was broad daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of paranoia. Finally, I worked up the nerve to go inspect the statues. As I tried to lift one, I immediately realized something. It was heavy. Way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even make one of those statues budge, no matter how hard I tried. While I was standing there, trying to figure out what to do, my wife came out to join me. One look at her face, and I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. She suggested that maybe some of the neighbors were playing a prank on us to mess with the new family on the block, but that theory didn't add up. We'd met all the neighbors by then, and they seemed like regular, down-to-earth folks. Honestly, I couldn't imagine anyone in their right mind pulling something like this on a family with small kids. This didn't feel like a harmless joke. It felt like harassment. We ended up calling the police. As expected, they couldn't do much. They suggested we put up security cameras, but we couldn't afford that kind of expense at the time. I told them we'd look into it, but deep down, I didn't want to take such a drastic step unless it got worse. After the officers left, I felt a little better, but my wife was still visibly shaken. We decided not to tell the kids about any of it. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. For the next couple of days, nothing strange happened. I started convincing myself that maybe the cops had scared off whoever was behind this. It made sense in a way, so I tried to move on, even though I never really felt at ease. Every time I walked past a window, I'd glance outside, half expecting to see something, or worse, someone. The feeling of being unsafe in your own home is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. A few days went by with no incidents, and I started to relax. For the first time since we moved in, it felt like the house was becoming a home. But looking back, I couldn't have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember if it was Saturday or Sunday, but I know my kids didn't have school that day. After breakfast, we headed outside to play in the yard. That's when I saw it. Spray painted in large, black letters on the back wall of the house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my youngest when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to keep them there. I don't know what came over me. I'm not exactly a brave guy, but something about seeing that graffiti sent me over the edge. I stormed into the garden, shouting threats at whoever might be hiding out there. Adrenaline was pumping through me, and I was ready for a fight. But no one was there. The yard was completely empty. As I made my way back to the house, the adrenaline wore off, leaving me with a sick, cold fear. This wasn't just a prank anymore. Whoever did this wasn't trying to be funny. They wanted to scare us, maybe even hurt us. We called the police again, and they came out to take another report. Unfortunately, without any solid evidence or leads, there wasn't much they could do. I asked them to stick around the property for a while in case someone came back, but they said they didn't have the resources to spare for something like that. The officer told me it was probably just some local teenagers causing trouble. I couldn't believe how casually they were brushing it off. They promised to have a patrol car swing by the neighborhood, which was better than nothing, but it didn't exactly make us feel safe. My wife was even more upset than I was, so I did my best to reassure her that everything would be fine, even though I was terrified inside. That night, while I was in the kitchen cleaning up, I heard my wife let out a blood-curdling scream from the living room. I dropped what I was doing and ran in. She was standing by the window, pointing outside. I followed her gaze, and my stomach twisted into a knot. Out in the backyard stood 5 people, each of them wearing white masks that completely covered their faces. They were moving in this bizarre, jerky way, almost like marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. We just stood there, frozen, watching them. Neither of us could move. It was horrifying. I had no clue what those people were trying to achieve, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever witnessed. Their bizarre, puppet-like movements held me in a kind of trance until I finally snapped out of it. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we owned and yelled at my wife to call the police. While she was dialing, I charged out the back door, knife in hand, shouting like a lunatic. I took a single step toward them before the reality of the situation hit me. There were 5 of them, and I was alone. For all I knew, they could have been armed. Panic set in, and I turned tail and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. I felt like a coward, but I also knew I couldn't risk putting myself in more danger. The knife must have startled them, though, because they stopped their eerie dancing and bolted toward the garden, disappearing from sight. I told my wife to grab the kids and hide upstairs while I stood guard by the back door, ready to defend my family if they tried to force their way in. By the time the police arrived, those masked figures were long gone. The officers searched the property thoroughly but found no trace of them. That was my breaking point. The very next day, I went out and bought security cameras. I didn't care about the cost anymore. Peace of mind was worth every penny. My wife was a wreck for weeks after that. She begged me to move, but I convinced her to stay, promising we'd leave if one more thing happened. Truthfully, I was terrified too, but financially, relocating would have crushed us. Fortunately, the cameras seemed to scare off whoever was behind it all. The strange incident stopped, and we haven't had any trouble since. But the most unsettling part is that we're still living in the same house, and we never did figure out who those people were, or what they wanted. Second story. My wife, Taylor, and I recently moved out of our old place. She wasn't a fan of living so close to her family and wanted some distance, so that's exactly what we did. We don't have kids, and Taylor stopped working a while ago, so she was pretty flexible about where we could go. I'm an electrician, and moving around isn't a big deal for me. After some searching, we settled on a spot in rural New Mexico. We've both been country folks all our lives, so it wasn't a drastic change for us. That was about 3 months ago. We managed to find a great deal on a house out in the middle of nowhere. Honestly, it's bigger than we really need. Just the two of us and our black lab, Lola. Still, we figured we'd make use of the extra space, maybe even host some friends down the line. For the first few months, everything was great. Then, odd things started happening. The upstairs lights kept tripping the circuit, even though the rest of the house had power. After it happened a couple of times, I knew exactly what was going on. Like I said, I'm an electrician. This stuff is second nature to me. I figured it was just an issue with the load distribution on the breaker, a pretty straightforward fix. To check things out, I headed down to the basement, where I figured the main breaker was. Funny thing is, I hadn't really spent any time down there since we moved in. When the realtor showed us the house, we glanced at the basement briefly, but I didn't pay it much attention. Walking down the stairs, I saw that the basement was packed with old furniture and random junk. It was more like a cluttered storage room than a usable space. After some searching, I found the main breaker and got to work. It took about 10 minutes to figure out the problem, a load imbalance. I made a mental note to rewire it when I had more time. As I was about to head back upstairs, curiosity got the better of me. I figured I might as well take a closer look around since I was already down there. Most of what I saw wasn't particularly interesting, just old chairs, tables, and other odds and ends. I quickly decided that turning the basement into a usable space would be way too much work. That's when I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old wooden chairs, was a large metal door. But this wasn't just any door. The door was unlike anything I'd ever seen in a house. It looked industrial grade, the kind of thing you'd find guarding a walk-in safe or a high-security panic room. It was also taller and thicker than a typical door, which struck me as odd. At first, I thought maybe it was a tornado shelter or a storm room. That would make sense, given how sturdy it looked, but it seemed like the kind of thing the realtor would have mentioned when we bought the place. I walked over to it and gave the handle a try, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Curiosity took over, and I went upstairs to dig through the drawer of keys the previous owners had left behind. They'd left a whole bundle for us, claiming they were for random doors, sheds, or locks around the property, just in case. I must have tried at least 15 keys, but none of them worked. Frustrated, I told Taylor about the door. She was just as intrigued as I was, and, to my surprise, she managed to track down the previous owners. I'm still not sure how she pulled it off, but we ended up calling them that same evening. That phone call changed everything. Right away, something felt off. The couple sounded hesitant, like they were carefully choosing their words or avoiding saying too much. They'd pause for long stretches, which made the conversation even more unsettling. Looking back, I wish I'd recorded the call, but hindsight's always 20/20ths. When I asked about the door, the line went quiet. After a long pause, the wife finally spoke. She claimed it was just a safe room for tornadoes, nothing unusual. I told her that sounded fine, but we couldn't use it since it was locked. That's when the tone shifted. After another pause, she said they'd lost the key and told us to just ignore it. Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. It didn't add up. Why leave us keys for every random lock on the property but conveniently lose the one for this massive, reinforced door? Taylor tried to laugh it off, saying I was reading too much into it, but I couldn't shake the bad feeling. Over the next few weeks, I found myself going down to the basement more and more, just to stare at that door. I'd stand there, wondering what could possibly be behind it. I tried everything I could think of to open it. Tricks I'd learned on the job, brute force, even tools. But the lock was rock solid. Eventually, I gave up and tried to put it out of my mind, but that only lasted about a week. The curiosity kept gnawing at me. Fast forward to 2 days ago, when things took a turn I'll never forget, despite Taylor's wishes. After weeks of frustration, I decided to bring in a locksmith. When he arrived, I showed him the door and let him get to work. He was down there for about half an hour before I went to check on him. "It's not your typical panic room lock," he said. "This one's unusually complex." His exact words sent a shiver down my spine. At first, I worried he wouldn't be able to open it, but to my surprise, after another 30 minutes, he cracked it. Looking back, I wish he hadn't. Inside the room, the air was stale, heavy with a strange, musty odor. The walls were lined with old black and white photographs, all covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Some looked hand-drawn. Others were scratched into the walls themselves. In the center of the room was a chair facing the wall, as if someone had spent hours, maybe days, just sitting and staring at nothing. To the side was a small cot with crumpled blankets that looked and smelled like they hadn't been washed in years. Then I noticed the trash. Empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles, and other scraps littered the floor. That's when it hit me. Someone had been living down here, and it wasn't long ago. I stood there, dumbfounded, struggling to process what I was seeing. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any worse, I noticed something else. On the far right side of the room, there was another door. Small, partially hidden in the dim light. My stomach dropped as I walked over and opened it. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading to the cellar door that opened into our house. I felt like an idiot. We'd lived here for months, and I'd never thought to check that cellar door. I had just assumed it led to the basement. The thought that someone could have been sneaking in and out of our home this whole time made my blood run cold. Suddenly, a lot of things started clicking into place. For months, Taylor and I had noticed little oddities. Things going missing, drawers or cabinets slightly out of place. I'd always chalked it up to Taylor being forgetful, something she'd admit to often enough. But now, I knew better. Someone had been living in our house. I had to repeat that thought in my head over and over before I could fully grasp it. I tried calling the previous owners, demanding answers, even considering threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Either they disconnected their number, or they were actively avoiding me. Taylor was understandably freaked out, and honestly, I was too. That night, I barricaded the cellar door from the inside with some of our heaviest furniture. I found a thick chain and padlock and secured it shut for good measure. There was no way I was letting anyone sneak back in. We called the police, who came out, took a full report, and said they'd try to track down the previous owners. Our realtor, horrified by the situation, promised to assist them however she could. That night, as Taylor and I were getting ready for bed, we heard it. A loud, heavy bang on the front door. Lola, our dog, shot up, barking like crazy. Taylor and I froze, staring at each other, neither of us daring to move. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, and we thought maybe it was over. But then, small rocks began tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor clung to Lola while I grabbed the baseball, but I kept under the bed. She begged me not to look, but I was furious by that point. I yanked the curtains aside, ready to confront whoever was out there. But there was nothing. I tried to reassure Taylor, but deep down, I was rattled. She wanted to call the police again, but I told her to wait. I wanted to catch whoever this was myself. A part of me didn't just want them gone. I wanted them caught. I told Taylor if anything else happened, I'd call. And then, from downstairs, came the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I sprinted downstairs just in time to catch sight of two figures bolting away from the house. The kitchen window was completely shattered, glass shards scattered everywhere. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived quickly and conducted a thorough search of the house, including the storm room and the basement. There were no signs of forced entry into the room, and they didn't find anyone on the property either. Their best guess? Whoever had been living down there was furious about being locked out and decided to scare us. The thought made my stomach churn. I was both livid and terrified. My wife has been a wreck ever since. She barely sleeps, constantly checking the locks and peeking out the windows. The police took the situation more seriously now that a crime had occurred. They promised to escalate their efforts to track down the previous owners, though they warned it might take a few days. That was 2 days ago. We still haven't heard back from the previous owners, and the silence is maddening. At least the police seem to have scared off whoever those squatters were. There haven't been any more incidents since that night. For now, things are quiet, but I'm not letting my guard down. I'm still in disbelief that something like this could happen at all. If we can't get answers from the previous owners soon, I'm not sure what our next step will be. I'm ready to defend my home if it comes to that, but I pray it doesn't. Third story. When I bought my first house, I was only 27. I'd been saving for years, and even though it was small and modest, I was proud to call it mine. Moving in was a big adjustment, though. I'd lived with my parents my whole life, along with my 3 siblings and 2 dogs. Our house was always loud, full of energy and life. But this was quiet, really quiet. At first, I wasn't sure I'd ever get used to it. Anyone who's gone from living with family to living alone probably knows what I'm talking about. One thing I loved about the place was this tiny balcony on the second floor. I don't even know if balcony is the right word. It was barely big enough to stand on, and there was no way I could fit a chair out there. But still, I went out there most nights after work to clear my head. I smoked a lot back then, but I hated the smell inside the house. The balcony was perfect. I could smoke without leaving home, and it felt like such a small luxury. The layout of the property is important to what happened next. My block was pretty typical. Houses lined up next to each other down the street. Behind my house was another row of homes, separated by tall, 10-foot fences marking the property lines. From my balcony, I could see over the fence into my neighbor's backyard. You could see the whole yard. Really? After a few weeks, I realized I'd met almost all my neighbors except the one behind me. Come to think of it, I'd never even seen them. No waves, no quick conversations, nothing. The guy never came out into the yard, never stood by the window, nothing. If it weren't for the occasional light in the bedroom window, I'd have thought the place was abandoned. The yard looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Overgrown grass, weeds everywhere. It seemed obvious an older person lived there, someone who couldn't keep up with the upkeep. After a while, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to introduce myself. One Saturday, I walked around the block to their front door. The place looked even worse up close. The paint was peeling, parts of the siding were scratched off, and the yard was just a mess. The doorbell didn't work, so I knocked a few times and waited. Nothing. I started feeling awkward, thinking maybe the house really was abandoned. But then I saw movement behind the curtain, just a quick flicker, like someone peeking out. Someone was in there, watching me but not answering the door. I turned to leave, but just as I stepped away, the door flew open with a loud bang, slamming against the wall. I jumped back, completely caught off guard. Standing in the doorway was an elderly Asian woman. She was short, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her skin was deeply wrinkled, but her expression, something about it was unsettling. Her eyes were wide, almost unnaturally so, and her face looked tense, like she was straining every muscle. She just stared at me. No smile, no words, just this intense, silent gaze. It was unnerving, to say the least. Finally, I managed to clear my throat and introduce myself. After a long pause, she spoke. "Priscilla," she said, her voice flat. That was it. No, nice to meet you. No questions about me, nothing. She just stood there, watching me like I was an intruder. I mumbled something polite and turned to leave. As I walked away, I realized I hadn't heard the door close. I didn't dare turn around to check. That night, I went out to my balcony like usual, trying to brush off the strange encounter. But when I glanced over the railing, there she was. Priscilla was standing dead center in her backyard, staring straight up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out. She just stood there, staring. It was the first time I truly felt unsafe in my own home. It was one of those surreal moments where you question if your mind is playing tricks on you. There she was, standing motionless in her yard, staring directly at my house. I debated whether to wave, say something, or just act like I hadn't noticed her. It was deeply unsettling, and I had no idea how to handle it. I finally decided to go back inside, convincing myself she was just an eccentric old lady who meant no harm. Still, the memory stuck with me, sending shivers down my spine every time I thought about it. The next night, I saw her again. This time, she was inside her house, moving from one window to another, watching me. Though I pretended not to notice, I felt her gaze. It was as if she knew I knew she was there, watching. When I finished my cigarette and went inside, I couldn't shake the feeling. Out of curiosity, I peeked out a window about 20 minutes later. To my horror, she was still standing there, staring at my house. I called my dad to tell him what was going on. He suggested she might have dementia or be lonely, insisting she was probably harmless. His reasoning calmed me down a bit, though it was hard to feel bad for someone who was borderline stalking me. For a few days, Nothing happened. I didn't see her in the yard or at her windows. I started to think maybe my dad was right. Maybe she was just confused and had moved on. But then one morning, I found a single sock lying in my yard, on my side of the fence. My stomach dropped. She'd been on my property. I stood there, staring at the sock, as a chill ran down my spine. This was no longer just strange behavior. It felt intrusive. I considered calling the police but decided against it, not wanting to escalate things with a neighbor. Looking back, I regret that decision. That night, just as I was dozing off, my doorbell started ringing. It wasn't a normal ring. It was rapid, relentless, at least a dozen times in a row. That night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, the doorbell started ringing. Not just once or twice, but over and over again. Rapid, frantic, at least a dozen times in a row. My stomach sank. I didn't even need to look to know who it was. At first, I felt more annoyed than scared, half asleep and irritated at being woken up. I threw on a shirt, determined to put an end to this once and for all. I told myself I'd simply ask her to leave me alone and that I'd been putting it off for far too long. I cringe now when I think about how naive I was. I didn't even consider how dangerous the situation could be. The moment I opened the door, she lunged at me. She came at full speed, a kitchen knife in her hand, her face twisted in pure rage. She was screaming, yelling incoherent things about how I had taken her son. Everything happened so fast. Instinct took over. I grabbed her arm and managed to wrestle the knife away. My heart was pounding as I pinned her to the ground. She was surprisingly easy to overpower, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. She kept thrashing and screaming, her voice filled with rage and desperation. At one point, she tried to bite me, but I held her down until the police arrived. Those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. My hands were trembling, my heart racing, as I kept her restrained. When the officers finally arrived, they quickly took over, restraining her and hauling her into the back of a police cruiser. Even as they shoved her into the car, she kept screaming, nonsense about her son, threats, and curses. I could still hear her cries as they drove away. The police assured me she would be taken to a psychiatric facility and made sure I was physically okay. But emotionally, I was shaken to my core. I never saw her again after that night, but the incident stayed with me. It left a permanent mark on me, making me more paranoid and cautious. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Less than a year later, I moved out and started fresh somewhere else. Even now, I sometimes find myself looking over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of that wild, desperate look in her eyes.